Hi, social psychology students. Today we're going to be looking at schemas. I'll give a definition of schema a bit later. This has to do with some of the things you read about in the warm-cold variable and first impressions, and we'll be taking a look at that pretty shortly. But first, I'm going to read a story to you, and we'll come back to this story a little bit later. One night, two young men from Egulac went down the river to hunt seals, and while they were there, it became foggy and calm. Then they heard war cries, and they thought, maybe this is a war party. They escaped to the shore and hid behind a log. Now canoes came up, and they heard the noise of paddles and saw one canoe coming up to them. There were 5 men in the canoe, and they said, "What do you think? We wish to take you along. We're going up the river to make war on the people." One of the young men said, "I have no arrows." "Arrows are in the canoe," they said. "I will not go along. I might be killed. My relatives do not know where I have gone. But you," he said, turning to the other, "may go with them." So one of the young men went, but the other returned home. And the warriors went on up the river to a town on the other side of Kalama. The people came down to the water, and they began to fight, and many were killed. But presently the young man heard one of the warriors say, "Quick, let us go home. That Indian has been hit." Now he thought, "Oh, they are ghosts." He did not feel sick, but they said he had been shot. So the canoes went back to Egulac, and the young man went ashore to his house and made a fire. And he told everybody and said, "Behold, I accompanied the ghosts, and we went to fight. Many of our fellows were killed, and many of those who attacked us were killed. They said I was hit, and I did not feel sick." He told it all, and then he became quiet. When the sun rose, he fell down. Something black came out of his mouth. His face became contorted. The people jumped up and cried. He was dead. So we'll come back to that example in a while. I want you to look at another example. This more directly relates to first impressions. What you're seeing in this photo is a picture of a type of monitor, a type of measuring device that's used to measure moment-to-moment attitudes toward things. When someone is watching something, this is often used in marketing research, it's used for political campaigns. If someone is developing a positive impression, they turn that dial to the right and it gives a higher score. And then if their impression becomes more negative, they turn it to the left and the score becomes more negative. So what you're going to see in the video is an example of this being used. A human resources professional will be interviewing 3 job candidates. And the people who made this video, this comes from a TV show that was called The Human Zoo. It never really quite caught on. It was supposed to be a reality show that was based in social psychology. So it had a very small audience, as you can imagine. Anyway, the woman who is interviewing these job candidates was given one of these monitors, one of these recording devices, and as she's doing the interviews for this position, she records her reactions to it. Now, I'm not going to actually show you the video within this presentation because the sound is really not great on the video, and so I want you to be able to go to the separate video. So I'll post the link to that, but I'd like you to watch that video just up until about 5 minutes and 45 seconds of that video. So watch the first 5 minutes and 45 seconds of the video, and then when you're done, you can come back. Okay, you're back. And we're going to take a look at what these things have to do with schemas. A schema is a cognitive structure. That's a really unsatisfying definition. But when we talk about schemas in psychology, we talk about them in cognitive psychology. So cognition means thinking, working with knowledge. It deals with things like language and problem-solving, decision-making, and memory. And a schema is known as a cognitive structure. I think it becomes easier to understand once you hear some examples. It represents knowledge about a concept. And the knowledge that you have about a concept, whether that's a person, a group of people, a situation, an idea, an object, when you have that knowledge, That knowledge then shapes how you perceive things. It shapes what you look for. It shapes your attention. It influences what you remember about something. It influences how you interpret information, and it influences how you behave even. It's something that we use to organize information so that when we're walking about in the world, we're not just taking in all these individual pieces of information. We come to our experiences with these cognitive structures, and we view our experiences through those cognitive structures. They're like templates or like lenses that we use. So in talking about impression formation, and that was the basis of the article that you read for today, that you did the questions over yesterday, Solomon Asch, who's a very famous social psychologist, we'll talk about him more when we look at conformity, came up with ideas about how people form impressions of others. And one of the possibilities, one of the theories that he came up with was the algebraic model of impression formation. The algebraic model suggests that people basically use what's like algebra when they're dealing with other individuals and when they're forming first impressions of them. So this is what is known as bottom-up processing. And if you've taken cognitive psychology or you've studied cognitive psychology at all, you've looked at bottom-up processing. Bottom-up processing refers to taking in individual pieces of information and putting them together to form a whole. When we're talking about impression formation, that would be taking in individual pieces of information about a person and then putting them together to form an overall impression. So this is the idea of using what we call individuating information. And you'll hear that term a lot in social psychology. Individuating information refers to information about the person as an individual, their individual characteristics. So not talking about their group memberships or their race, their ethnicity, their age. I mean, those are all pieces of information, but evaluating the person on individual features, their individual skills, their individual characteristics, their individual personalities, their individual experiences, and using that to form an impression of them. According to this model, the order of information would be unimportant. So first impressions would not be really all that important, because as you're gathering information about people, you would be altering your impression of that person. So it wouldn't matter if you would get a good piece of information first or a bad piece of information, because the next piece of information you get about that individual would then go into the overall equation of how you see them. So take, for example, cold, which is seen as a pretty negative characteristic. You saw the warm, cold variable. So if you say someone is cold, and then you also say that they're intelligent, intelligent is seen as pretty positive. I mean, it's not, what Ash would say it's not extremely positive, but it's pretty positive. So according to this model, if you find out someone is cold, okay, then you have a negative first impression, but then you find out they're intelligent, that should really soften that negative impression, and you should average those together and come up with a moderately negative judgment. Finding out that they're intelligent should then reduce that negativity to some extent. If you find out that someone is warm, you get that first impression of them. That's very positive. And then intelligent, which is moderately positive, then you're going to add those things together and come up with a very positive judgment. So according to this theory of how we form impressions, we take individual pieces of information, and just as they come along, we continue to make those adjustments to our initial impression. So this model would say that first impressions really don't matter all that much, because as we're gathering more information, we're constantly changing our impression, and we're using those pieces of information and weighing them in a reasonable way and coming up with an overall impression based on the individual pieces of information. So that's one possibility. The other possibility that Ash talked about was what he called the configural model of impression formation. And according to this theory, we use top-down processing. Instead of taking individual pieces of information and adding them together and then seeing what we end up with, balancing out positive and negative, taking each new piece of information and using that, we start with a first impression or an overall impression that could be due to our experience with someone, or it could be due to a stereotype that we have of the social category that person belongs to. And then when we encounter new information, we view that information in light of the initial impression that we formed. So it's having a schema and then interpreting things in light of that schema. So we use a schema, we develop that. It might be we've heard about this person. It might be that we've had an initial interaction with this person and it was positive or it was negative. It could be based on a stereotype. So say you have an overall positive first impression of someone, and then you find out that they're also intelligent. Well, it's likely that you're going to perceive intelligence also in a positive way, and that's going to fit into that overall positive impression. So, oh, okay, they're intelligent. That's good. They're probably very skilled. They're probably very clever. But what if you at first, well, then you would develop an overall positive judgment. But what if at first you had a negative impression of the person? Maybe they were not friendly to you, or they made a mistake. One of the things in the video that you saw is that one of the applicants, this happened to be the actress, had spelling mistakes in her resume or her CV, and that gives a bad impression. So what if you have an overall negative impression of someone and then you find out they're intelligent? Well, in this case, according to this theory, we take that overall negative impression and we use that as a lens through which we view this new piece of information. And so now intelligence is not necessarily seen as moderately positive. Maybe it's seen in a more negative light. Oh, this person is probably really conceited, and they're probably always trying to talk about how smart they are, or they're probably always going to be emphasizing their own view, or they might be snooty. So that would end up giving you a negative first impression of that individual, or a negative overall impression. And this seems to be a model that actually fits with really how we do things. Maybe bottom-up processing would be a more fair way of evaluating people, but it looks like we actually use more top-down processing. And here's what Ash did to try to examine that. He gave people information about a person and then asked them to give their rating of that person. So some participants saw this list. This person is intelligent. This person is industrious. This person is impulsive. This person is critical. This person is stubborn. This person is envious. And then had them rate them on a 1 to 5 scale from an extremely negative to extremely positive impression. Participants in another condition saw these exact same characteristics, but they saw them in the opposite order. So instead of starting out with intelligence, they started out with envious, and then stubborn, critical, impulsive, industrious, intelligent. And again, they were asked to do the same kind of thing with the rating. Now, those are exactly the same lists. They were just in opposite orders. But what Ash found was that when people were presented with the more positive characteristics first, like intelligent and industrious, they gave higher ratings to the individual, more positive ratings to the individual, than if they saw those more negative characteristics first, envious and stubborn. So they got the exact same amount of information and the exact same information, but the initial information served as a schema, and then they interpreted things in line with that. So impulsive you could see that positively, or you could see it negatively. Positively, it might be, oh, they're fun-loving, they're spontaneous. Negatively could be they are hot-headed, they are not wise in what their behaviors are. Industrious, if you're perceiving that in a positive way, that is a good thing. They work hard. They've got a good work ethic. But industrious for someone who is stubborn or someone who has some other kinds of negative, you have a negative overall impression of them, you could think that, oh, well, they're very serious. They don't have any fun. They are scheming. They're competitive. So there could be different ways of interpreting that. So Ash found that really the algebraic model is not how we form impressions of people. We form impressions through initial impressions that we have that then allow us to form schemas, and we interpret things through those schemas, through those templates, or through those lenses. So I want to talk briefly about the types of social schemas that exist. We can talk about schemas for lots of different things. We're obviously going to focus on social ones for this class. One type of social schema is a person schema. A person schema is a schema about an individual. You form this in your first impression. The example of the job interview is a good example of a person schema, forming a schema of that one individual. And that the human resources person, the employer, is forming a schema based on their application materials and then based on what they look like when they show up to the interview and how they act those first few seconds of the interview. But you can also form person schemas through other types of information. Someone could tell you about someone else. So an example of a person schema would be if you are trying to decide what class to take and you want to know which professor to take the class with, then you might talk to friends who have had experience with that professor, and then they'll tell you their impression of them. They'll tell you information about them, and then you develop a schema of that professor based on what you've heard about them. So the social schema of a person schema about an individual can come through your own experiences, or it can come through other kinds of information. It could be information that the person himself or herself presents. So if you think about people using dating apps, they want you to develop a certain type of person schema. And we'll talk about some of those self-presentation strategies a little bit later. So a person schema consists of that particular individual's traits, their goals, their characteristics, their likes, their dislikes, all kinds of information. And it's a cognitive structure that organizes information about an individual. When you are first meeting an individual, you first hear about them, that schema is pretty underdeveloped. And then as you get to know more, as you get more information, then you have a stronger, more well-established schema for that person. So if you take a moment to just list 10 characteristics about yourself, you can complete this 10 times. I am. So do that 10 times. And if you look at what you gave for answers for that, those things that you wrote, now if you're talking about characteristics and not just like your mood or, not I am hungry, not some type of state, but if you're talking more about characteristics, what you use to describe yourself, those characteristics represent your self schema. So not only do we have schemas about other people and individuals, but we have schemas about ourselves as well. And we're going to spend time talking about the self and how social psychologists study the self. But self schemas include your knowledge about yourself. That's a pretty rich and well-established kind of schema. You know about your own goals, you know about your characteristics, you know about your strengths and your weaknesses, the things you like, the things you don't like. So there are some ways when we think about ourselves that are really important to us. So if someone thinks about their height a lot, they might say, I am short or I am tall. And that's an important part of their schema. They might talk about that and present it right away. And then it's likely that they will be schematic for that, meaning that not only do they think about themselves in terms of their height, but they think about other people in terms of their height. That's what they notice about people. That's how they remember individuals. I am not very schematic when it comes to height. So sometimes people will be talking to me and they'll say, do you know so-and-so? And I'll say, no, who's that? And they'll say, well, it's that really tall guy. And I will have no idea. I don't really even notice people's height. Most people are taller than I am, so I don't really notice it very much. So I would say I'm not self-schematic for that, but instead aschematic, a meaning an absence of something. I really don't think about that very much. I don't think about height. But I do think about where people are from. And that's something that when I talk about myself, I talk about how I am from Iowa. That's where I was born. That's where I grew up. And I'm pretty schematic for other people about that too. So you can think about the things that you're schematic for and the things you're not schematic for. Role schemas deal with different social roles. So that can be something like doctor, mother, teacher, sister, friend, neighbor. Some of those roles we consider ascribed roles, and those would be things like sister, cousin. We also can think about different roles that people have that deal with their age, for example. That would be ascribed, meaning that you automatically have them. And then there are some that are, we call achieved, and achieved indicates that it sort of implies that it's something you work towards, something that you really, really want. But achieved just means that you don't naturally have it and you maybe seek it out. So that would be something like your profession, your career, or if you're a member of a particular group that you've joined, then that would be an achieved role. So I am part of the Bane family, and that's an ascribed role. I didn't choose that. And I am a college professor. That's an achieved role because I chose to do that. And achieved also, that term kind of implies that there's some status, a higher status involved, and that's not really what it means. It just means that this is something that you've chosen. And we have schemas for these different things. So we know what is a mother supposed to be like, and how do you think about a mother and what's their role and what should they act like. And that the schema that you have of that is going to be based on your experiences, but it's also based on things like what you see in the media and other stories that you've heard. We think about things like a physician, and that's an example of an achieved role. And we have different things that are associated with that. It might be someone who's a physician is intelligent. Someone who's a physician has gone to medical school. Someone who's a physician is comfortable with blood and needles. I don't know. You probably have lots of different types of things in your schemas. So those are role schemas. And then the final one that I'll talk about are event schemas. These are called scripts. And when we talk about social scripts, that deals with how we might expect to interact with other people. So let me give you an example here before I go back to that. Okay, so John goes to a restaurant. He is seated by the host. The server gives him a wine list, and he chooses a bottle of wine to order. He looks over the menu. He orders fettuccine Alfredo. And then after he's done with the meal, the server brings the bill and he pays the bill. So does that go along with this type of restaurant or this type of restaurant? Or probably the fancy restaurant, right? We have an idea of events and the steps that go along with events. And so we know what happens when we go to a restaurant. We know what happens when we go to a physician's appointment. And when it comes to social scripts, you might have different kinds of scripts about what is a job interview supposed to be like, what is a date supposed to be like? And what are the steps that occur? Or even more general, how does what's your schema, your script of a relationship, a romantic relationship, and how that forms and how it develops and what happens over time? You might have a schema of a classroom or a class as occurring in a place that looks kind of like this, and then people come in there and it's at a specific time. And this probably was not something that was part of your schema for classes until more recently. So those are some different types of schemas. In the next video, we're going to be taking a look at the effects that schemas have on how we process social information, and then also on our behavior.